people are still conscious. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 22 in just a moment. If you want to be turning there, we'll get to it in just a moment. Page 828 if you're using the Bible in the pew. But after death, we are still conscious. And in fact, we think about Matthew chapter 17. Matthew chapter 17 is the Mount of Transfiguration. That's where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up on the mountain. And Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus there on the mountain, and they're talking to Jesus about the coming crucifixion. But if you're not careful, you'll skip over it. Who appeared to him? Moses and Elijah. Moses had been dead for about 1,500 years. Elijah had been dead for maybe 800 years. But Peter, James, and John were able to recognize those men. They knew who they were, even though they'd never met them. Peter said, let's build 3 tents of worship, tabernacles. One for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. These men kept their identity, even though they themselves had been physically dead for millennia, for centuries. Think about Luke chapter 16 in the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And here again we see that people retain their consciousness even after death. And we had a lesson on the rich man and Lazarus not too long ago. You remember the rich man was wealthy, took care of himself, ignored Lazarus. Lazarus laid at the gate of the rich man with sores on his body that the dogs came by and licked. And Lazarus was just poor and hungry and miserable. They both died. Jesus says Lazarus was taken with angels to Abraham's bosom. There's Father Abraham. There's that idea of comfort for the Israelite mom. And the rich man also lifted up his eyes, being in the Hadean world, the unseen world, but he himself was in torment. We can draw some conclusions based on that story Jesus tells us about the rich man and Lazarus. Now, it does not matter if it is a real story and actually happened or if it was a parable. It doesn't matter because Jesus is going to teach something false regardless. And so the rich man says to Father Abraham, he says, I want you to send Lazarus back home. You see the memory there? He says, I want you to send Lazarus back home. Why? Because the rich man still knew, even though he was dead, that his brothers were not ready for death. He was still conscious, and he still knew about his brothers. And he knew they were not ready. Now, it's unfortunate that he became an evangelist too late. He became interested in his brother's souls too late. Because Abraham says there's a great gulf separating us from you so that Lazarus cannot go down and do anything to comfort you. You certainly can't go back home and talk to your brothers. They've got Moses and the prophets. Let them read the Bible. That's Abraham's message. But the rich man was conscious. The rich man remembered his family relationships. And he remembered that his brothers were not ready. So the question is, in death, do people still retain at least some degree of their pre-death relationship? Looks to me like we can already draw a conclusion. Sure sounds like it, doesn't it? Sure sounds like it. Now let's look at this passage from the New Testament. Turn to Matthew chapter 22. And let's see about this discussion that Jesus has here with a group of Jews called Sadducees. Now he tells us in verse 23 that the Sadducees were a group of Jews. They were a sect of the Jews, or a denomination of the Jews, if we want to use that modern term. They were a group of the Jews who did not believe in the resurrection from the dead. The Sadducees were the priests. They were the aristocrats. They were the wealthy people. And they accepted the law of Moses. They accepted the books of Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But they were not so happy about some of the rest of the Bible, the rest of the Old Testament. And so they don't believe in a resurrection. And they come to Jesus, just like the Pharisees. They did like Jesus, draw drawing all crowds to him, and they were losing influence and control over people's lives. And so they come to him with this test in verse 24. And they say, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother is next of kin shall marry his wife to raise up children for his brother. Now that's from Deuteronomy chapter 25. And so their question is, verse 25, there were 7 brothers with us. The first married and died, having no children, left his wife to his brother. So also the second, the third, down to the 7th. Now last of all, the woman died also. Now we're going to get to their question in a moment. My question is, why did those other brothers marry that woman? I'm like, you've already lived through 4 of my brothers, not brother number 5. And those all died, Think me stupid or what, but I think I'll pass on that marriage. But anyway, all 7 of them married her, they all died. And she dies also. So the question is, verse 28, in the resurrection, therefore, whose wife of the 7 will she be, for they all have married her? Now they think that they've got Jesus in a predicament. This woman has been married to 7 men. Who's going to be her husband after death? Well, see, they think that that's ridiculous. They think that question is so ridiculous that Jesus is going to have to come right out and say, there is no resurrection of the dead. Or he's going to say something else that's just going to sound silly and he's going to lose his influence. But you can't play tricks on God. You can't ask God. You can ask me questions I can't answer, but you're not going to ask God questions He can't answer. And so Jesus answered them, verse 29. First of all, He says, you are mistaken because you do not know the Scriptures. You don't understand the Scriptures or the power of God. Now, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they both thought they were the religious leaders. They were the know-it-alls. They knew the Bible, the Old Testament. But Jesus says, you're mistaken because you don't know the Scriptures or the power of God. Now, He's going to talk about the power of God in verse 30. In the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. Now that verse right there gives us a whole lot of information, doesn't it? Once we get to heaven, marriage is not going to serve its purpose. God created marriage here on this earth to propagate the race. He created marriage, as we all know, for companionship. He created marriage for friendship. He created marriage for recreation. There's a number of reasons why God created marriage, but none of those reasons obtain once we cross the threshold of death. We won't need to propagate the race. We'll be in God's presence. We won't need help and encouragement through this life. We won't need all of that. We'll be in God's presence. Now, Jesus here doesn't say we will be angels. That's a common misconception that hopefully we all have grown out of after we left childhood. Jesus doesn't say we become angels. Angels and human beings are 2 different created beings. But He says we will be like angels, having bodies that are spiritual, that do not need the physical, as we talk about. And so, there's neither married nor given in marriage. But verse 31, Jesus goes back to the point about not knowing the Scriptures. To these Sadducees who accepted the book of Genesis and Exodus, for example. In verse 31, Jesus says, regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read? Go back to the Bible. Have you not read what was spoken to you? Notice He personalizes it. God says this to you. Even though He quote from Exodus, even though He wrote Exodus in 1400 BC, Jesus said God was speaking to you. So let me tell you, brethren and friends, when we read out the Bible this morning, and Matthew was written, say, about 50 AD, so it's what, 1950 years old, Jesus would say, Matthew was written to you. Okay, that's because God's Word is living and powerful. So Jesus said, the Word was spoken to you by God. Verse 32, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, Jesus said, but the God of the living. Now, if you don't think about it, you can pass over that and miss the point. That passage that Jesus quotes from is in Exodus chapter 3. Moses is at the burning bush. Remember that story? And God is trying to get Moses to go back to Egypt and lead his people out. And Moses says, who am I going to tell the Israelites sent me? God says, you need to tell them that I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, Abraham died in Genesis chapter 25. And here God is speaking in Exodus chapter 3. That is several hundred years after Jacob died. And yet God tells Moses, I am, there's the point, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God doesn't say, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Even though they have been dead for centuries. What's Jesus' point? Here's the point we don't need to miss. Jesus' point to the Sadducees was that when God said that in the burning bush, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were still alive. Not physically, but spiritually. They were still alive in the unseen world. He doesn't say, I was the God. He said, I am the God of these men who are physically dead. Now, when the crowds heard this, verse 33, they were astonished at his teaching. You can see their jaws had dropped because it is so profane. Jesus makes that argument based on the grammar of the text. So what do we learn? We learn, Jesus here clearly says, there is no marriage in heaven. We don't need marriage in heaven. But we also see that we do maintain our identity and we remember our relationships even after death. Now think about this for just a moment. If we did not maintain our identity, and part of my identity, in fact, is Rachel's husband, isn't it? In fact, that's who I am when I go downtown. I'm not Paul Hall at preacher at the Very Church of Christ. I'm Rachel Hall's husband. She's the artist. And that's how they know me downtown. So we maintain part of our identity, our relationships after death. If we didn't, then we would all be nameless, we would all be faceless, we'd all be a bunch of numbers in heaven. Now, where is the comfort and joy in that? Let me give you a couple of other verses from the New Testament before we conclude our study this morning. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 14, the Apostle Paul is writing to young Christians. He's baptized them into Christ. And he says, knowing that he who has raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. Notice that Paul is finding joy in anticipating being in heaven with those people that he had baptized into Christ. Well, if he doesn't recognize them in heaven, where's the joy